On the 19th day of August in 1942, Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imai found himself standing amid the oppressive jungle vegetation near Taivu Point on the island of Guadalcanal. As an officer in the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company, Imai committed his observations to his personal diary, recording impressions that would prove prophetic about the profound shock awaiting Japanese military forces in their confrontation with American troops. The tropical foliage surrounding him and his fellow soldiers created an almost impenetrable canopy overhead, where palm fronds intertwined with creeping vines to block out much of the sky above. Imai had arrived with 916 other men under the command of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, all of them having completed a nighttime landing from destroyer vessels that had brought them to this remote shore under cover of darkness. Japanese command had briefed these soldiers with intelligence suggesting the American presence on Guadalcanal numbered perhaps 2,000 men at most, and that these enemy forces consisted of poorly trained troops who would likely flee when faced with determined Japanese assault. Colonel Ichiki himself had expressed dismissive confidence in the face of suggestions that he await additional reinforcements before engaging the Americans. His assessment, shared among his officer corps, held that these were merely American soldiers, men who could be driven into the sea before the sun rose on the following day. What neither Ichiki nor any of his subordinates understood was that they stood on the threshold of an experience that would fundamentally challenge every assumption held by the Imperial Japanese Army regarding warfare in the modern age. These were not inexperienced troops that Colonel Ichiki had brought to Guadalcanal. These men had fought across China and throughout Southeast Asia, accumulating combat experience in campaigns where Japanese forces had known nothing but continuous victory since 1937. They were about to encounter something entirely outside their frame of reference. This would not simply be a defeat, though defeat itself represented an almost inconceivable outcome for soldiers whose entire military careers had been marked by triumph. Instead, they would experience the systematic dismantling of every tactical principle, every strategic assumption, every ideological conviction that had defined Japanese military doctrine for decades. The very jungle that had seemed like familiar terrain would be transformed into an instrument wielded by their American adversaries. The darkness that Japanese forces had exploited so effectively throughout their previous campaigns would turn against them. The supposed superiority that Japanese commanders claimed in close-quarters combat would prove illusory when confronted with the overwhelming advantages the Americans possessed in equipment, coordination, and sheer destructive power. The sequence of events that led to this moment had begun 2 weeks prior, on the 7th of August, when 11,000 United States Marines belonging to the 1st Marine Division came ashore at Lunga Point. Under the command of General Alexander Vandergrift, these leathernecks were executing what military planners had designated Operation Watchtower, marking the first offensive action undertaken by American forces in the Pacific theater of the war. The objectives appeared straightforward when outlined in operational planning documents. The Marines were to seize control of the airfield that Japanese construction crews had nearly completed, establish a defensive perimeter around this critical installation, and maintain their position until additional forces could relieve them. The reality of what awaited these Marines bore little resemblance to the clarity of written orders. They were embarking upon what would become the most prolonged and savage campaign in the history of the Marine Corps up to that point in time, fought in environmental conditions that would push human endurance to absolute limits. The island itself presented a vision of tropical landscape that seemed designed to torment human beings. Guadalcanal stretched across 90 miles of length and 25 miles of width, with an interior dominated by mountain peaks that reached 8,000 feet into air permanently shrouded in clouds. The coastal plain, where the Japanese had constructed their airfield, consisted of a narrow strip featuring kunai grass, swampland, and jungle growth so thick that visibility could drop to mere feet within its depths. The heat pressed down with suffocating intensity, while humidity levels never fell below 90%, regardless of the time of day or night. Mosquitoes swarmed in such dense clouds that soldiers sometimes inhaled the insects with each breath. Rivers and streams that appeared clear and inviting in aerial reconnaissance photographs teemed with parasites and microscopic organisms that caused disease. Malaria would eventually sicken virtually every man who spent significant time on the island, while dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would disable more personnel than enemy weapons would kill or wound. That first morning when the Marines came ashore, they discovered the airfield defended by almost no one. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops stationed there chose to flee into the jungle interior rather than fight, abandoning equipment, supplies, and most critically, the airfield itself in various states of completion. By the time night fell on the 8th of August, American engineers had already begun work to finish the runway construction that the Japanese had started. They would name this installation Henderson Field, choosing to honor Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had been killed during the Battle of Midway. Within a matter of days, the first aircraft would land on the completed runway, and the island would become home to what military historians would later remember as the Cactus Air Force. The Japanese military response came with remarkable swiftness, though it would prove catastrophic for American naval forces operating in the waters around Guadalcanal. On the night of the 9th of August, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led a force consisting of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer through the darkness, executing a brilliantly conceived surprise attack that would go down in history as the Battle of Savo Island. This engagement became the single worst defeat suffered by the United States Navy in its entire history. 4 heavy cruisers were sent to the ocean floor in less than 1 hour of combat. The USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and the Australian vessel HMAS Canberra all went down, taking more than 1,000 sailors with them into the flaming waters. The surviving Allied naval vessels withdrew from the area, taking with them the majority of supplies that had not yet been unloaded onto Guadalcanal's beaches. The Marines found themselves stranded on the island, cut off from naval support, facing a reinforced enemy while possessing barely half of the equipment and food supplies they had anticipated having available. What the Japanese High Command failed to comprehend during those early days of August was the extent to which Henderson Field had become the key to everything that would follow. Whoever controlled the airfield would control the surrounding seas during daylight hours. Aircraft operating from Henderson possessed the capability to strike any Japanese ship that came within 200 miles of the island. This single fact would dictate the entire character of the campaign that followed. The Japanese could dominate the nighttime hours, utilizing fast destroyers to transport troops and supplies in runs that American personnel would come to call the Tokyo Express. However, when dawn broke each morning, American aircraft would rule the skies above Guadalcanal and its surrounding waters. The strategic situation demanded that Japan retake Henderson Field with maximum speed before American forces could fortify their positions to the point where dislodging them would become impossible. Imperial General Headquarters assigned this critical task to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army, which maintained its headquarters at Rabaul. Hyakutake found himself with only limited forces immediately available for deployment. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was stationed at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment remained in the Philippines. The unit positioned closest to Guadalcanal was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, which had been stationed near Guam, originally designated for the Midway operation that had been cancelled following the naval disaster suffered there in June. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki came to this assignment with a reputation as an infantry school instructor of the first rank and a tactician of considerable skill. He also carried a reputation for impulsiveness and for maintaining supreme confidence that Japanese fighting spirit could overcome American material advantages. Before departing from Truk for Guadalcanal, Ichiki received explicit orders directing him to wait for the arrival of the remainder of his regiment before attempting any assault on the airfield. Ichiki, however, held American soldiers in remarkably low regard. He had studied after-action reports from China, from the Philippines, from every location where Japanese forces had encountered Western troops, The consistent pattern he believed he saw was that American soldiers lacked proper discipline, would break under sustained pressure, and could not match Japanese warriors in the brutal intimacy of close combat. On the night of the 18th of August, 6 destroyer vessels delivered 917 men, constituting Ichiki's first element to Taivu Point, located 15 miles east of the American defensive perimeter. The landing proceeded smoothly, with American forces detecting nothing. Ichiki immediately dispatched reconnaissance patrols with orders to assess enemy strength and identify defensive positions. This seemed like routine tactical procedure, the sort of decision any competent commander would make. It would prove to be a fatal error. On the 19th of August, a patrol from Company A of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, operating under Captain Charles Brush, was moving along the coastal track toward Coley Point when they encountered Japanese soldiers. The two forces collided in a brief but vicious firefight that left 31 Japanese soldiers dead and resulted in the capture of documents revealing the presence of a substantial enemy force in the immediate area. More significantly, the captured papers demonstrated that the Japanese had severely underestimated the strength of American forces on the island. Captain Brush rushed back to the defensive perimeter with his intelligence findings. General Vandergrift immediately grasped what this information meant. A Japanese attack was imminent. It would likely come soon. The approach would probably be from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to strengthen defensive positions along the sandbar located at the mouth of what Marines had mistakenly identified as the Tenaru River, though it was actually the Ilu River, a misidentification that would persist in all subsequent historical accounts. Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines along the riverbank, positioning machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire that would cover the entire sandbar area. What transpired next would be recorded as one of the most one-sided battles in the entire history of the Marine Corps. Colonel Ichiki, rather than waiting for intelligence reports from his missing patrol or for the arrival of reinforcements, made the decision to attack immediately. On the night of the 20th of August, continuing into the early morning hours of the 21st, he ordered a frontal assault directly across the sandbar. Japanese military doctrine emphasized the superiority of spiritual power over material force and advocated aggressive night attacks as the means to overcome enemy firepower through sheer audacity and close-quarters fighting where Japanese soldiers were trained to excel with bayonets and grenades. Just after midnight, Solomon Islands scout Jacob Vuza, who had managed to escape from Japanese captors after enduring hours of torture, stumbled into Marine defensive lines with a warning that the Japanese were advancing. Within minutes, the attack began in earnest. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, screaming battle cries, firing their rifles, hurling grenades toward Marine positions. They ran directly into a killing zone that the Marines had prepared with methodical precision. The M1917A 1 Browning water-cooled machine guns opened fire, and these weapons, which had been perfected during the First World War, proved themselves once again as instruments of devastating effectiveness. Each gun could sustain 600 rounds per minute indefinitely, limited only by the need to keep the water jacket filled for cooling. The Marines had positioned these weapons in mutually supporting positions, ensuring that no portion of the sandbar remained uncovered by overlapping fields of fire. Japanese soldiers fell in waves as the heavy .30 caliber rounds tore through flesh and shattered bone. Those who somehow made it across the sandbar encountered 37mm anti-tank guns that had been loaded with canister rounds, which functioned essentially as giant shotgun shells, turning human bodies into shredded meat. The attack continued for hours, with wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charging into the relentless machine gun fire. Some managed to reach Marine positions and engaged in desperate hand-to-hand combat, with Marines fighting using rifles, knives, their fists, anything that came to hand. But the defensive preparations held firm. The interlocking fields of fire prevented any breakthrough that might have allowed Japanese forces to exploit a gap in American lines. As dawn approached, Colonel Ichiki's attack had completely stalled. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallow water. The arrival of daybreak brought no relief for the surviving Japanese soldiers. General Vandergrift ordered a counterattack utilizing elements of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, with 5 M3 Stuart light tanks crossing the sandbar to begin systematically hunting down Japanese soldiers who had taken cover among the coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis, observing from a Marine position, later described what he witnessed. The tanks moved among the trees, pivoting and turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame from their weapons. It became apparent that there were far more Japanese soldiers in the grove than anyone had realized. Group after group were flushed from cover and shot down by the tank's canister shells. By midday on the 21st of August, the Battle of the Tenaru had concluded. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, approximately 800 were dead. Roughly 128 survivors, mostly from support units that had remained near the landing site, melted into the jungle interior. They would manage to send a radio message to the 17th Army headquarters reporting the disaster. Among the dead was Colonel Ichiki himself, though accounts differ regarding the manner of his death. The official Japanese version maintained that he burned his regimental colours and committed ritual suicide. Some witnesses insisted he died while leading a final charge. Marine casualties numbered approximately 40 killed and wounded. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese soldiers proved devastating. Captured documents and accounts obtained after the war revealed the profound shock produced by learning that an entire regiment had been annihilated in a single night. The Americans had not fought according to the patterns Japanese doctrine predicted. They had not panicked when subjected to night attack. They had not broken ranks when charged by screaming warriors. Instead, they had waited in carefully prepared positions, allowed the Japanese to enter designated killing zones, and systematically destroyed them with concentrated firepower, delivered with mechanical precision. The most devastating revelation came from examining captured equipment and assessing the battlefield aftermath. The Americans possessed a level of material wealth that Japanese intelligence had completely failed to comprehend. The Browning machine guns never jammed, never overheated beyond their designed operational capacity, never failed due to poor maintenance or inadequate spare parts availability. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad possessed. The artillery support that Marines could summon exceeded anything Japanese forces could deploy under any circumstances. The coordination between infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire from ships positioned offshore represented an integrated system of destruction that Japanese forces had never previously encountered in their combat experience. Within days following the Tenaru disaster, additional Japanese forces were already en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a massive naval operation designed to support the next attempt to retake Henderson Field. 3 slow transport ships departed Truk on the 16th of August, carrying the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Ichiki's regiment plus 500 naval marines. After the naval battle of the Eastern Solomons resulted in heavy damage to one of these transports, Japanese command made the decision to abandon the use of slow transport ships entirely for Guadalcanal operations. Instead, they would employ destroyers for what became known as the Tokyo Express runs. Between the 29th of August and the 4th of September, various destroyer and light cruiser vessels delivered almost 5,000 troops belonging to Major General Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express system worked brilliantly as a method for moving soldiers. Destroyers could complete the round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal within a single night, minimizing their exposure to American air attack. However, the method contained a critical weakness that would prove fatal to Japanese operations. Heavy equipment could not be transported using this approach. Artillery pieces, tanks, trucks, and most importantly, adequate quantities of food and ammunition had to be left behind at base areas. This logistical reality would ultimately doom every Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Soldiers arrived carrying only what they could physically bear on their backs. They became dependent on local foraging and whatever supplies could be infiltrated through American defensive lines. As the campaign wore on, Japanese troops would find themselves fighting not merely against American firepower, but against the slow starvation that came from inadequate rations. General Kawaguchi established the 12th of September as the target date for his assault on Henderson Field. His operational plan called for a three-pronged attack design. One force would strike from the western direction along the coastal area. A second force would attack from the south, penetrating through dense jungle to strike at what Japanese intelligence assessed as the weakest point in American defensive arrangements. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort from the southern approach, moving along an inland ridge feature that dominated Henderson Field from that direction. What Kawaguchi did not know was that Marine intelligence had already identified this ridge as the most probable avenue of approach for any attack from the south. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding officer of the 1st Raider Battalion, conducted a raid on Tasimboko village on the 8th of September and discovered massive supply dumps there, clear evidence that a large Japanese force was concentrating in the area for offensive operations. Edson immediately grasped what the Japanese operational plan must be. They would approach from the south, utilizing the ridge as their attack route. Edson requested and received permission to establish a defensive line on the ridge itself. On the 10th and 11th of September, Edson positioned approximately 840 Marines from his Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge feature. He selected defensive positions with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized the Tanaru River defenses. Machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Mortar crews registered their weapons on likely approach routes. Artillery crews from the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions covering all avenues of approach. Every advantage of terrain and available firepower was carefully calculated and prepared. The ridge itself consisted of a narrow coral spine, approximately 1,000 meters in length, featuring 3 distinct hill masses covered with kunai grass and scattered tree growth. Deep ravines bordered both sides of the ridge, heavily wooded and in some places virtually impenetrable. This terrain was ideal for night attacks by infiltrating infantry forces. It was also, if properly defended, an ideal killing ground. On the night of the 12th of September, Kawaguchi's forces initiated their assault. Unlike Ichiki's straightforward frontal charge, this represented a more sophisticated tactical approach. Japanese infantry infiltrated through the ravines on both sides of the ridge, attempting to envelop American positions from multiple directions. Small units probed continuously for weak points in the defensive line. When they identified promising locations, larger forces would concentrate for breakthrough attempts. The fighting became savage and chaotic in character. In the darkness, Marines sometimes found themselves engaged in hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated to within grenade-throwing range of defensive positions. But once again, the defensive preparations held firm against repeated assaults. When Japanese forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts, Marine mortars and artillery from the 11th Marines shattered these concentrations with devastating effect. The artillery fired more than 2,000 rounds during the night, dropping high-explosive shells so close to Marine positions that shrapnel from these friendly fire missions wounded American troops. Machine gun crews fired their weapons until the barrels glowed red-hot in the darkness. Individual Marines fought with whatever came to hand, including rifles, pistols, knives, and entrenching tools. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuser, the same scout who had warned of the Tanaru attack, moved through the defensive lines encouraging Marines and pointing out Japanese infiltration attempts. Sergeant John Basilone manned a machine gun position that became absolutely critical to the defense. When members of his gun crew were killed or wounded, Basilone continued firing alone, repelling wave after wave of Japanese attacks through the night. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions during this battle. In total, 2 Marines would earn the Medal of Honor at what became known as Edson's Ridge, while 19 would receive the Navy Cross. As dawn broke on the 13th of September, the Japanese attack had failed to achieve any breakthrough of American lines. However, Kawaguchi still had additional troops available and prepared to renew his assault the following night. Edson pulled his defensive lines back slightly to the center of the ridge, consolidating his forces into a tighter perimeter. General Vandergrift dispatched reinforcements, bringing the total defending force to approximately 2,500 men. The Japanese would attack again, but this time the Marines were prepared with even stronger defensive positions and more concentrated firepower available. The second night's fighting proved even more intense than the first. Kawaguchi threw his remaining forces into desperate attempts to break through American lines before reinforcements could make the Marine position completely impregnable. Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly into machine gun fire, dying by the hundreds in these attacks. Some assault waves came within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped by concentrated fire. At one critical point, the situation became so desperate that Edson himself grabbed a rifle and joined the firing line alongside his Marines. But once again, American firepower and defensive preparation prevailed against Japanese determination and courage. By dawn on the 14th of September, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely collapsed. Japanese casualties reached staggering proportions, with approximately 830 to 850 Japanese soldiers killed on and around the ridge that would forever after be known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge. Marine casualties totaled approximately 104 killed and over 200 wounded between the Raider and Parachute battalions combined. The ridge had become a monument to the effectiveness of American defensive doctrine when properly applied. For Japanese soldiers who survived this battle, the experience represented another profound shock to their understanding of modern warfare. Captured diaries and accounts obtained after the war consistently described the same realization among survivors. Japanese forces had expected to fight other infantry in darkness, where their superior training and warrior spirit would produce triumph. Instead, they had encountered artillery, machine guns, and mortars, all concentrated with a precision they could not match. American commanders had known the Japanese were coming, had prepared killing zones, had waited for Japanese forces to enter these zones, then destroyed them with coordinated fire support that seemed inexhaustible. The battles at the Tenaru River and Bloody Ridge established patterns that would repeat throughout the remainder of the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces would launch attacks based on courage, night infiltration tactics, and close combat expertise where they believed they held advantages. American forces would respond with overwhelming firepower, coordinated combined arms operations, and defensive positions carefully prepared to maximize every advantage available to them. The outcome of these engagements became grimly predictable. Japanese casualties would reach catastrophic levels. American casualties would be significant but sustainable given the replacement pipeline operating from the United States. Numbers alone fail to capture the complete horror of jungle warfare on Guadalcanal. The environment itself became a weapon that killed with complete impartiality between the opposing forces. Malaria infected nearly every man who spent more than a few weeks on the island, regardless of which army he belonged to. By December of 1942, the 1st Marine Division would report over 8,000 cases of malaria among its personnel. Tropical diseases of various types disabled approximately 2/3 of the division's strength at different points during the campaign. Dysentery affected virtually everyone. Men suffered from fungal infections that ate through layers of skin tissue. Jungle rot caused open sores that refused to heal in the constant humid heat. Dental problems with no possibility of proper treatment led to abscessed teeth and systemic infections throughout the body. The Japanese forces suffered conditions even worse than what the Americans endured. Their supply situation meant inadequate food from the very beginning of operations. Soldiers were theoretically supposed to receive standard field rations, but the Tokyo Express destroyer runs could rarely deliver sufficient quantities. Men subsisted on whatever they could forage from the jungle environment, supplemented by occasional rice deliveries that had to be stretched impossibly thin across too many hungry mouths. Starvation became a constant companion for Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal. Medical supplies were almost completely non-existent after the first few weeks. Quinine for malaria prevention ran out quickly and was never adequately resupplied through subsequent transport runs. Wounded soldiers often died from infections that would have been easily treatable with proper medicines and surgical care. Japanese documents captured later in the campaign painted a horrifying picture of conditions their forces endured. One medical officer's report from late October noted that more than 60% of the 17th Army's forces on Guadalcanal were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition, with combat effectiveness dropped to perhaps 30% of authorized strength levels. Soldiers were dying at a rate of 50 per day, with most deaths resulting from starvation and disease rather than combat wounds. American supply ships, protected by Henderson Field aircraft during daylight hours, regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment to Marine forces on the island. Shortages did occur, particularly during August and early September, when naval defeats had temporarily left the Marines cut off from resupply. However, these shortages proved temporary in nature. By October, the flow of supplies had become reliable and consistent. Marines consumed canned rations that, while hardly appetizing by peacetime standards, provided adequate calories and nutrition to maintain fighting strength. Ammunition remained plentiful enough that machine gunners could fire their weapons until barrels wore out from sustained use, then request replacement barrels from supply depots. Medical care included field hospitals with surgical capabilities, plasma for blood transfusions, sulfur drugs for treating infections, and eventual evacuation of serious cases to rear-area hospitals in safer locations. Japanese logistics, by contrast, consisted of whatever could be physically carried on destroyer decks during high-speed nighttime runs or infiltrated through American defensive lines by small groups moving through the jungle. Soldiers learned to make a single rice ball last an entire day of activity. Ammunition had to be conserved to the point where orders often restricted firing to only when absolutely necessary to avoid exhausting limited supplies. Medical care meant receiving a bandage if fortune smiled upon you, amputation without anesthesia if your luck ran poor, or death if your wound became infected with no medicines available for treatment. Seriously wounded soldiers were often given hand grenades and left behind to commit suicide rather than burden their units with immobile casualties or risk the shame of capture by enemy forces. In late October, the Japanese mounted what would be their largest offensive operation of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. General Hyakutake himself travelled to Guadalcanal to personally command the operation from the island. He brought with him elements of the 2nd Division, including experienced troops who had fought extensively in China. The operational plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, with the main effort coming from the south through dense jungle, similar to the approach route used during the Bloody Ridge battle. This time, however, Japanese forces would have substantially more men available, better coordination between attacking units and artillery support that had finally been delivered to the island via destroyer runs. The offensive began on the 23rd of October with a preliminary attack launched from the western direction. 9 Japanese tanks, rare on Guadalcanal because of the extreme difficulty involved in transporting such heavy equipment, led an assault across the Matanikau River. American defenders, including elements of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the Army's Americal Division, were prepared and waiting. Anti-tank guns, artillery pieces, and even an M3 Stuart tank engaged and knocked out all 9 Japanese tanks in quick succession. The attack collapsed with heavy casualties among the supporting infantry. The main assault came on the night of the 24th into the 25th of October. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the southern direction, hoping to break through American defensive lines positioned south of Henderson Field. They faced the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The fighting that night entered Marine Corps legend as one of the most intense defensive battles in the organization's history. Japanese attacks came in continuous waves throughout the hours of darkness. Individual breakthroughs that managed to penetrate American lines were immediately sealed by counterattacks before Japanese forces could exploit these gaps. Machine gunners fired their weapons until the mechanisms failed from overheating and overuse, then grabbed rifles and continued fighting as riflemen. Artillery crews from the 11th Marines fired danger-close fire missions that landed shells within yards of Marine defensive positions, risking friendly casualties to stop Japanese breakthrough attempts. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington stood ready to provide naval gunfire support if the situation required such massive firepower to be brought to bear. At one critical moment during the night, only a single Marine battalion stood between concentrated Japanese forces and Henderson Field itself. The line held through sheer determination and devastating defensive firepower. By morning, the Japanese offensive had failed completely. General Nasu lay dead, killed by machine gun fire during one of the nighttime attacks. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers had died in the attempt to break through American lines. American casualties numbered several hundred killed and wounded, severe losses but sustainable given the ability to receive replacements. October of 1942 also witnessed major naval engagements that decisively shifted the balance of power in the waters surrounding Guadalcanal. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days from the 12th through the 15th of November, featured some of the most intense surface combat in naval history. In a confused nighttime melee on the 13th of November, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force that included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott both died in the fighting, becoming the only 2 American flag officers killed in surface engagement during the entire Second World War. American losses included 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers sunk, with 3 additional destroyers damaged. However, the Japanese lost the battleship Hiei, which was disabled during the night action and subsequently sunk by aircraft attacks the following day. More significantly for the overall campaign, the bombardment mission failed in its objective. Henderson Field remained operational and capable of launching aircraft. On the night of the 14th into the 15th of November, the battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment mission against Henderson Field, but was intercepted by the American battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a devastating demonstration of American radar-directed gunnery capabilities, Washington placed 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely see their target in the darkness. Kirishima sank with heavy loss of life among her crew. Perhaps most significantly for the land campaign, American aircraft and surface ships destroyed a Japanese convoy that was attempting to land the 38th Division with heavy equipment and substantial supplies. Of 11 transport ships in the convoy, only 4 managed to reach Guadalcanal's shores, and these 4 were destroyed by aircraft attacks and artillery fire before they could fully unload their cargo. Japanese casualties from this convoy operation exceeded 5,000 men, many of whom drowned when their transport ships went down or were killed by strafing aircraft as they attempted to swim ashore. This marked the final serious attempt by Japanese forces to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force capable of sustained offensive operations. For Japanese troops already on the island, November represented the beginning of the end of any hope for victory or even survival. They had expected substantial reinforcement and adequate resupply to enable continued offensive operations. Instead, they learned that the naval battles had resulted in Japanese defeat, that the convoys carrying reinforcements had been destroyed, that no additional help would be forthcoming. Ration allocations were reduced yet again. Men already suffering from starvation were instructed to survive on even smaller portions. Medical supplies that had been critically short since September became completely non-existent by November. The sick and wounded filled makeshift field hospitals where doctors could do nothing except watch their patients die slowly from untreatable conditions. Captured Japanese diaries from this period of the campaign paint a horrifying picture of gradual collapse among Japanese forces. Diary entries describe rice rations reduced to 1 small ball per day, barely enough to sustain life even without the energy expenditure of combat operations. Disease spreading everywhere through the ranks with no medicines available for treatment. Bodies being burned when soldiers retained sufficient strength to gather wood and perform cremations. The growing realization among the troops that no more supplies would arrive from Rabaul. Men attempting to eat grass and tree bark to supplement inadequate rations. Deaths from consuming poisonous plants that desperate soldiers could not distinguish from edible vegetation. The physical deterioration of once proud soldiers into desperate, starving shadows of their former selves. December brought the final reckoning for Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. Japanese command authorities at Rabaul made the decision to evacuate all remaining forces from the island. They could not publicly admit defeat given the political and psychological implications. However, privately they recognized that continuing the Guadalcanal operation meant accepting the complete annihilation of the 17th Army through starvation, if not through American firepower. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained alive on the island, down from a peak strength that had reached 36,000 personnel at various points during the campaign. Of those 11,000 survivors, perhaps 7,000 retained sufficient physical strength to walk unassisted. The remainder were sick, wounded, or so weakened by prolonged starvation that they could barely crawl. The evacuation operation, designated by Japanese planners as Operation K, would prove to be one of the most successful Japanese military operations of the entire war, despite occurring in the context of strategic defeat. Using destroyer runs similar to the Tokyo Express methods employed to bring troops to the island, Japanese naval forces extracted 10,152 men over 3 consecutive nights in early February of 1943. This represented a remarkable achievement executed under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. However, the successful evacuation could not disguise or diminish the magnitude of the defeat Japanese forces had suffered on Guadalcanal. Japanese forces deployed to Guadalcanal reached a peak strength of approximately 36,000 personnel, counting all army, naval and construction troops committed to the island. Of this total, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 died during the campaign. Approximately 14,800 were killed in combat actions, while between 10,000 and 15,000 died from disease and starvation. American casualties proved severe but ultimately sustainable given American industrial capacity and manpower reserves. The Marines and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. However, American industry and manpower mobilization could replace these losses continuously. New divisions were already in training throughout the United States. Ships and aircraft were being produced at rates faster than combat could destroy them. The strategic initiative in the Pacific War had permanently shifted to American forces. The psychological impact of the Guadalcanal campaign on Japanese military thinking cannot be overstated in its significance. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese forces had been comprehensively defeated in sustained ground combat. Every major offensive operation had failed to achieve its objectives. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactical doctrine had resulted in catastrophic casualties without corresponding American collapse. The Americans had proven themselves not merely materially superior, which Japanese planners had anticipated to some degree, but also tactically competent, well-led, and capable of enduring the same terrible environmental conditions that Japanese soldiers faced. This realization shattered fundamental pre-war assumptions about American military capabilities and fighting spirit. Japanese officers who survived the Guadalcanal campaign and later wrote memoirs or were interviewed by historians after the war consistently emphasized several themes in their reflections. First, they acknowledged having completely underestimated American fighting qualities across every dimension of military effectiveness. Second, the disparity in equipment and supplies between the two forces proved far greater than intelligence assessments had suggested would be the case. Third, Japanese logistics systems were fundamentally inadequate for sustaining prolonged operations against an enemy force that controlled both sea and air around the operational area. Fourth, spiritual power and superior tactical skill at the small unit level proved insufficient to overcome systematic disadvantages in firepower and material resources. Post-war accounts obtained from Japanese veterans revealed consistent assessments of what they had learned on Guadalcanal. They had entered the campaign believing themselves to be superior warriors based on their training, their willingness to accept death, and their mastery of night fighting and close combat techniques. However, on Guadalcanal they learned a harsh lesson about modern industrial warfare. War in the 20th century was decided by systems rather than by individual warrior qualities. The Americans possessed effective systems for everything that mattered in sustained combat operations. They had systems for supply logistics, for medical care and evacuation, for artillery support coordination, for air support integration with ground operations. Every one of these systems functioned reliably throughout the campaign. Japanese systems, by contrast, failed repeatedly because they had never been properly constructed in the first place to support the kind of sustained operations that Guadalcanal demanded. Japanese veterans who survived the campaign and were later interviewed by historians provided detailed accounts that directly contradicted official Japanese military explanations for the defeat. These veterans acknowledged that American forces fought with great effectiveness at night when defending properly prepared positions. They admitted that Americans endured malaria, dysentery, and terrible environmental conditions while still maintaining combat effectiveness because their logistics systems supported them adequately. They recognized that American firepower proved overwhelming in its volume, precisely coordinated in its application, and accurately delivered against Japanese targets. A single American battalion possessed more effective sustained firepower than an entire Japanese regiment could bring to bear in comparable circumstances. The technical aspects of American material superiority were significant and measurable. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal fought with Arisaka rifles, which were bolt-action weapons requiring manual cycling between individual shots. American Marines initially carried M1903 Springfield rifles, which were also bolt-action designs, but these were increasingly supplemented by the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle as these newer weapons became available in the theatre. The Garand's 8-round N-block clip capacity and semi-automatic operation provided substantial advantages in firefights where volume of accurate fire often determined outcomes. The disparity in machine gun capabilities told an even starker story of material imbalance. The American M1917A1 Browning employed water cooling technology that allowed the weapon to sustain continuous fire indefinitely as long as water and ammunition remained available. Japanese machine guns, primarily the Type 96 and Type 99 models, were lighter in weight and more portable across difficult terrain. However, these weapons lacked the sustained fire capability that proved decisive in defensive operations. When defending fixed positions, this difference became absolutely critical to battle outcomes. Artillery superiority perhaps represented the most significant material advantage American forces enjoyed. The 11th Marines operated M1A1 pack howitzers that could be disassembled into components light enough to be transported through jungle terrain where vehicles could not travel. These 75mm weapons provided responsive and accurate fire support to infantry units in contact with enemy forces. Forward observers embedded with infantry units could call for fire missions and receive artillery rounds impacting on target within minutes of the initial request. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal remained limited throughout the campaign, proved difficult to move through the jungle environment, and suffered from chronic ammunition shortages that prevented effective employment even when guns were properly positioned. Naval gunfire support added yet another dimension of firepower that Japanese forces simply could not match under any circumstances. American destroyers and cruisers positioned offshore could deliver bombardments against Japanese positions or provide responsive fire support missions for Marine ground units engaged in combat. Radio communication systems linking shore-based forward observers with naval vessels enabled precise targeting of naval gunfire against specific enemy positions. This represented a level of fire support integration that Japanese forces never achieved during the Guadalcanal campaign. Air power became increasingly dominant as the campaign progressed through its 6-month duration. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field under conditions that tested both men and machines to their limits, gradually established complete air superiority over Guadalcanal and its surrounding waters. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flying F-4F Wildcat fighters, P-39 Airacobra fighters, and P-40 Warhawk fighters intercepted Japanese bomber raids with increasing effectiveness as American pilot experience levels increased. SBD Dauntless dive bombers struck Japanese ground positions, supply ships attempting to reach the island, and troop concentrations wherever they could be identified. Japanese air forces operating from Rabaul had to fly at the extreme limits of their operational range to reach Guadalcanal, which gave them minimal time over target and left them vulnerable to interception by American fighters during their long return flights. The final American ground offensive, launched in January of 1943, demonstrated with complete clarity how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted during the 6 months of fighting. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, which now included both Marine and Army divisions operating under unified command, launched coordinated attacks that systematically reduced the remaining Japanese defensive positions through overwhelming application of firepower. The offensive enjoyed overwhelming support from artillery batteries, aircraft operating from Henderson Field, and naval gunfire from ships positioned offshore. Japanese resistance, while still determined at the small unit level, was severely hampered by starvation that had reduced soldiers to shadows of their former strength, by disease that left most men barely capable of walking, and by ammunition shortages so severe that many positions could offer only token resistance before being overrun. On the 9th of February in 1943, American patrols advancing through areas previously held by Japanese forces discovered that enemy troops had completely evacuated their positions during the preceding nights. General Patch composed and transmitted his famous message to Admiral Halsey, informing higher command that the Tokyo Express no longer maintained a terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign had concluded after 6 months of brutal fighting that resulted in the first major American ground victory against Japanese forces in the Pacific War. More significantly for the remainder of the conflict, the campaign established operational patterns and revealed fundamental truths that would shape American and Japanese strategic approaches throughout the years of fighting that still lay ahead. The lessons that Japanese survivors extracted from their Guadalcanal experience proved devastating to pre-war military doctrine and assumptions. The myth of inherent Japanese warrior superiority had been comprehensively shattered through repeated battlefield defeats. Individual courage and tactical skill at the small unit level proved inadequate to overcome systematic disadvantages in firepower, logistics, and material resources. Night attacks and close combat operations, which represented the hallmarks of Japanese tactical successes throughout the China campaigns, failed consistently against American defensive positions that were properly prepared and adequately supplied. Supply and logistics, which Japanese military culture had traditionally treated as secondary concerns subordinate to fighting spirit, proved to be fundamental requirements for sustained combat operations in modern industrial warfare. Air superiority and naval control determined outcomes on the ground regardless of the courage or skill displayed by infantry forces. These lessons, learned through blood and starvation on Guadalcanal's jungle ridges and malarial swamps, should have fundamentally reformed Japanese military thinking for the remainder of the war. Some perceptive officers did recognize the profound implications of what had occurred. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer who visited Guadalcanal during the height of the campaign, wrote afterward that Japan needed to completely reassess its strategic approach to the war. The Americans, he observed with clarity unusual among Japanese staff officers, were fighting an industrial war where material production rates determined ultimate outcomes. Japan could not prevail in an industrial war waged against American productive capacity, which exceeded Japanese industrial output by factors of 10 or more in critical categories like aircraft, ships, and motor vehicles. However, Japanese military culture, constructed over generations of tradition and reinforced by recent victories throughout Asia, could not easily absorb or adapt to these painful truths. The official explanation for the Guadalcanal defeat attributed the failure to inadequate supply deliveries, to naval defeats in the waters surrounding the island, and to the unexpected strength of American defensive positions. These explanations contained elements of truth but avoided acknowledging the deeper reality. Japanese tactical doctrine itself was fundamentally flawed for modern industrial warfare. The entire conception of warfare that had served Japan effectively against Chinese forces was obsolete when applied against a modern industrial opponent capable of bringing overwhelming material resources to bear in sustained operations. Those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and were subsequently captured during later campaigns, or who survived the war entirely and were interviewed by historians in subsequent decades, became witnesses to a transformation they had never anticipated experiencing. They had entered the Guadalcanal campaign as confident warriors serving what they believed was an invincible empire destined to dominate Asia. They departed the island, those fortunate enough to be evacuated, as starving, disease-ridden survivors of a catastrophic defeat that had cost their nation tens of thousands of irreplaceable veteran soldiers. Many of these survivors later described Guadalcanal as the precise moment when they first understood with certainty that Japan would ultimately lose the war regardless of how many more battles might be fought or how much additional blood might be shed. Post-war testimonies obtained from Japanese veterans over subsequent decades captured this profound psychological transformation with remarkable consistency. They acknowledged learning truths during the Guadalcanal campaign that military and political leaders had deliberately hidden from the Japanese public. The Americans were not weak or lacking in fighting spirit, but instead proved themselves overwhelmingly strong across every dimension of military capability. This strength manifested not merely in weapons and equipment, though American material advantages were indeed enormous, but more fundamentally in organizational effectiveness, in logistic systems that actually functioned, in leadership that made sound tactical decisions, and in the ability to sustain complex combat operations over extended time periods. Japanese forces fought with undeniable courage and considerable tactical skill at the small unit level. None of this mattered in the final analysis. American forces fought using integrated systems and virtually unlimited resources that Japanese forces simply could not match under any circumstances. The American perspective on Guadalcanal emphasized somewhat different lessons drawn from the same 6 months of savage fighting. For Marines and Army soldiers who fought on the island, the campaign provided definitive proof that American forces could match Japanese troops in the brutality and intensity of jungle combat when properly trained, equipped, and led. The mythology of Japanese invincibility that had dominated American thinking during the dark months following Pearl Harbor was permanently destroyed on Guadalcanal's ridges and river crossings. American defensive doctrine, when properly applied with adequate preparation time, worked effectively against Japanese offensive tactics. Combined arms coordination integrating infantry, artillery, air support, and naval gunfire proved highly effective in both defensive and offensive operations. Individual American soldiers and Marines, when properly trained and adequately equipped, were fully capable of defeating Japanese forces in any type of combat environment. American forces also developed profound respect for Japanese soldiers as tough, determined, highly skilled adversaries who would continue fighting to the death rather than accept surrender under almost any circumstances. The willingness of Japanese forces to continue launching attacks in the face of hopeless tactical situations, to endure starvation that reduced grown men to walking skeletons rather than give up the fight, to choose death over the perceived dishonor of capture made a lasting impression on American combat veterans. This was not an enemy that would quit simply because the situation appeared hopeless by rational military assessment. The contrast between how the two sides approached prisoner welfare and surrender illustrated fundamental cultural differences that would persist throughout the Pacific War. American forces made sustained efforts to encourage Japanese surrender through various means, including dropping surrender leaflets, broadcasting radio messages in Japanese offering good treatment, and providing medical care and adequate food to the small numbers of prisoners who were captured. These efforts achieved minimal success during the Guadalcanal campaign and throughout most of the Pacific War. Of approximately 36,000 Japanese troops who served on Guadalcanal at various points during the campaign, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive by American forces, and the majority of those captured were too severely sick or wounded to physically resist. The strategic implications of the Guadalcanal campaign extended far beyond the island itself and its immediate surroundings. Japan's comprehensive failure to retake Henderson Field through 6 months of sustained offensive operations, culminating in the eventual evacuation of all remaining forces, demonstrated conclusively that the Japanese defensive perimeter established during the initial 6 months of war could indeed be penetrated and rolled back. Allied strategy for the Pacific War shifted decisively from defensive operations aimed at containing Japanese expansion to offensive campaigns designed to progressively reduce Japanese-held territory. The industrial and material advantages that America possessed in abundance could be systematically translated into military victories if these resources were applied with sound operational planning and adequate tactical competence. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of an irreversible decline that would continue until final surrender in 1945. The loss of tens of thousands of experienced troops, veteran pilots, and irreplaceable naval vessels could not be compensated at anything remotely approaching the rate at which America was producing new forces and equipment. The decision to evacuate Guadalcanal, however quietly this decision was communicated within Japanese military and political circles, represented an implicit admission that Japan could not sustain attritional warfare against American industrial might over any extended time period. The veterans of the Guadalcanal campaign on both sides carried their experiences with them for the remainder of their lives. American Marines and soldiers who survived the 6-month ordeal became cadres for newly forming units, passing along hard-won lessons about jungle warfare effectiveness, defensive tactics against night attacks, and combined arms coordination in difficult terrain. The 1st Marine Division pulled off Guadalcanal in December of 1942 after being ground down by disease and casualties, required many months of rest, recuperation, and reconstitution before returning to combat operations in later campaigns. Japanese survivors faced an even grimmer future ahead of them. Those fortunate enough to be evacuated during Operation K in February of 1943 were dispersed as replacements to other units deployed throughout the steadily shrinking defensive perimeter Japan still maintained across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. These men carried with them the psychological burden of comprehensive defeat and the certain knowledge that American forces were far more formidable opponents than pre-war propaganda and intelligence assessments had ever suggested. Many of these Guadalcanal survivors would die in subsequent battles as Japan's strategic position continued its steady deterioration throughout 1943 and into 1944. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore visible scars of 6 months of intense combat for many decades following the campaign's conclusion. Wrecked aircraft from both sides littered jungle clearings and shorelines. Destroyed vehicles slowly rusted into oblivion in the tropical environment. Abandoned equipment of every description remained scattered across former battlefield areas. Unexploded ordnance continued to pose dangers to local inhabitants for generations after the last shots were fired. Henderson Field, substantially expanded and improved both during and after the campaign, served as a major Allied base supporting subsequent operations throughout the Solomon Islands chain and beyond. For military historians and strategic theorists, Guadalcanal provided extensive case study material examining amphibious operations, jungle warfare in tropical environments, logistics challenges in remote theaters, air-ground coordination techniques, and the integration of naval power with land operations. The campaign demonstrated with brutal clarity that modern warfare in the industrial age required far more than brave soldiers and sound tactical skills. Success demanded massive industrial capacity to produce equipment and supplies, highly effective logistics systems to deliver these materials where needed, technological superiority or at minimum parity across weapons systems, and most fundamentally, the organizational ability to sustain complex combat operations over extended periods measured in months rather than days or weeks. The human cost of Guadalcanal proved staggering when calculated for both sides combined. More than 7,000 American and Japanese naval personnel died in the series of naval battles fought in the waters surrounding the island over 6 months. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing in action. Japanese losses exceeded 30,000 personnel from all causes, including combat, disease, and starvation. Additional thousands on both sides suffered from tropical diseases and physical conditions that would affect their health and quality of life for however many years they had remaining. The strategic significance of what was accomplished on Guadalcanal justified, at least in cold military calculation, the terrible human cost paid by both sides. The campaign represented the critical turning point where Allied forces shifted decisively from defensive posture to offensive operations throughout the Pacific theater. It demonstrated beyond any doubt that Japan could be defeated in sustained ground combat when American forces were properly equipped, adequately supplied, and competently led. It established patterns of air superiority and naval dominance that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War as American industrial production continued to accelerate while Japanese capacity steadily declined. The story of Japanese forces encountering American military power on Guadalcanal ultimately represents a narrative about the collision between two fundamentally incompatible philosophies of modern warfare. One side entered the campaign believing firmly in the supremacy of warrior spirit over material considerations, in courage and determination overcoming disadvantages in equipment and supply, in superior tactics producing victory regardless of resource disparities. The opposing side believed with equal conviction in the systematic application of industrial power to military problems, in logistics and sustained firepower as essential force multipliers, in combined arms coordination as the key to operational success in modern combat. The jungle environment of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these conflicting military philosophies met in sustained combat over 6 months of savage fighting. The outcome, though it required half a year of brutal warfare to reach its inevitable conclusion, demonstrated that properly concentrated fire support and effective logistics, when combined with sound tactical doctrine and determined soldiers willing to endure terrible conditions, created a form of military power that Japanese forces could not match regardless of their courage or tactical skill. For those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and lived to share their stories in subsequent years, the campaign represented the precise moment when harsh reality destroyed comfortable illusions they had carried into combat. They learned that their training had been based on fundamentally false assumptions about how modern industrial warfare would be conducted. They discovered that their tactical doctrine had been designed for a different type of war against a different caliber of opponent. They realized that their logistics systems had been inadequate from the very beginning of operations and could never have sustained the kind of prolonged combat Guadalcanal demanded. Most painfully, they came to understand that their nation was engaged in a war it could not possibly win through military means alone, given the enormous disparity in industrial capacity between Japan and the United States. The Americans who fought on Guadalcanal learned equally important lessons, though these carried very different implications. They proved to themselves and to their nation that they could match Japanese soldiers in the sheer brutality of jungle combat when the test came. They demonstrated that American industrial power could indeed be effectively translated into military victory when applied systematically with competent leadership. They developed and refined tactical doctrine for jungle warfare that would serve them well in the long series of island campaigns still ahead. Perhaps most importantly, they completely shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, replacing it with a realistic assessment of a tough and determined but ultimately defeatable enemy. Guadalcanal became the place where Japanese forces experienced terror of a particular kind, not from American soldiers as individual combatants, though these men certainly proved themselves formidable fighters, but from the systematic, overwhelming, absolutely relentless application of firepower and material resources that American forces brought to bear in every engagement without exception. This represented a terror born not from fear of death itself, which Japanese military training had conditioned soldiers to accept as a possible and even honorable outcome, but rather from the gradual realization that personal courage and willingness to sacrifice meant nothing against an enemy whose supplies never ran out, whose wounded soldiers received proper medical treatment, whose artillery seemed to fire without ever exhausting ammunition stocks, whose aircraft controlled the skies above the battlefield, and whose industrial base could replace combat losses faster than fighting could inflict them. The fundamental transformation that began when Japanese forces first encountered the full weight of American military power on Guadalcanal marked a decisive shift in the character and trajectory of the Pacific War. From that point forward, through the remainder of the conflict, Japanese forces would find themselves fighting defensive battles with steadily diminishing resources against an enemy whose material advantages grew progressively larger with each passing month. The jungle warfare patterns established on Guadalcanal became the template for countless subsequent island campaigns, repeatedly proving that American forces could fight and win in the most difficult terrain imaginable against a determined enemy, provided they maintained adequate logistics support, effective fire support coordination, and overwhelming firepower superiority over their opponents.